It's interesting that I think the timing of the year that these transactions take place is actually really relevant to what happens. For example, when we came into Philly, we basically closed on the transaction in late June. So there was really nothing we could do for that year, which I actually think was very fortuitous for us because it allowed us to just kind of sit back as observers, get to know everybody. Got a chance to start to build some relationships around the league, although everybody knows that takes a long time, and just start to formulate our own views on what was separating the people who were being successful from those that weren't. That was also a situation where the owner was kind of publicly denying at that point that he wanted to sell the team, but we felt we had pretty reliable information that if he got the right price, he would. It's kind of funny now to think back, we paid $185 million to buy the team. And if you Google it, you'll see we were ripped to shreds for overpaying by such a ridiculous amount of money. It seems funny even now, almost surreal as we talk about, $4.5 billion price. And both of the last two transactions basically doubled the value of teams in similar categories in the league. I mean, you just don't see that in business. We've never seen that in sports. And there are some justifications for it. Some of them are purely political. It's extremely advantageous for somebody who's really wealthy from a tax perspective to own a football team. And that's part of the justification for the price. But obviously, the NFL has continued to have areas of very, very significant growth, whether it's a Thursday night package, the development and expansion of things like streaming, whether it's being in a position to take something like NFL ticket and kind of re-auction it off every 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever length they decide to do. And a similar thing with Cleveland, but there we came in, we actually took over the team in the middle of the season. And frankly, it was almost not enough time to get to know what we needed to and get everybody kind of on the same page by the time we got to January and needed to start to take some steps. In both cases, we tried to reassure the existing employees as much as we could. But while also being really honest with them, we did not go in and say, listen, everybody's good here, no changes, you should all relax and take a deep breath. What we said was that we're committed to building a first-class organization that had a chance to compete every year with the best teams in the league. That we were going to go through a period of observing, and we're going to be very aggressive in the people that we thought had the ability to be part of that, and re-signing them, extending them, making them feel like we really believed in them. And we'd also make some decisions, some areas where we didn't think the strengths were there to be part of an organization that could consistently be in the top 4 to 8 teams every year in the league. But for me, the key is there are very, very few, close to zero owners that have succeeded even the first for the first 4 or 5 years they're in the league. There is just a real legitimate learning curve. Some of it's around building relationships. Some of it's understanding how the league works. Some of it's just knowing what to trust and who to trust and who not to trust. So as I said, we really got lucky. We weren't smart about it, that we got 6 or 7 months when we took over the Eagles before we really had to make any decisions at all. We had an interesting season. Rich Kotite was our head coach with a roster we didn't think was very talented, but after 9 games, he was 7-2. Unfortunately, from our perspective, and probably his too in the long run, he made the mistake at that point of going public and demanding a contract extension. And we had gone into it thinking it was very unlikely he'd be our long-term coach, but wanted to kind of give him a fair chance to prove himself. So we really hadn't made a decision. So that's kind of the short story. I mean, negotiating one of these deals is as interesting and fascinating and challenging as you would think. They're multi-billion-dollar deals. They have a lot of pieces to them. You're negotiating with a large number of people. It's not like a normal business where somebody may hire a lawyer. You may have a lawyer, the 4 of you sit down and try to negotiate a deal. It's much more complicated. One thing that I make a point that is just constantly misreported, transactions are between teams and future owners. The league has a role in approving the owner, researching the owner, making sure they feel like he fits, that his character and his agenda are all positive. But I'm familiar with owners that thought by becoming best friends with, you name it, Jerry Jones, Bob Kraft, Roger Goodell would get them a team. May help them get some introductions, may have somebody who could be an advocate and a recommendation. But the transactions are between 2 parties that are owning the business and selling the business. which again, I say you get this, review of it by the league. But I think in the last 40 or 50 years, there's only been one transaction was rejected by the league, and all of the conversations and all these transactions are between the selling team and the buying team. And no one else really gets involved. The way wealthy people save a lot of tax money is through something called depreciation. And when you depreciate an asset, you're basically taking a credit against taxes that are owed. So players are on very short term. Some things the government makes you write off over 20 years. So to get a big benefit from something is a very long-term project. Some categories are things like player salaries, stadium renovations, inherent assets of a team that exist, all have pretty accelerated opportunities to warrant these credits and get this depreciation. Sometimes it's for revenue that has absolutely nothing to do with your football team. If you did a traditional evaluation of a business acquisition, you would never feel like the Denver Broncos were worth $4.5 billion. If you add in all of these benefits and you have an owner who already has significant outside income, you can very easily come to analysis that thinks investing $4.5 billion makes sense.
When someone pays $4.7 billion for a team, what kind of profits do they expect?
Well, most people invest in a business hoping that at absolute minimum, if there were no other benefits of investing, they'd get at least an 8% return on their investments. Wealthy people have access to things where making 12, 15, 18% on an investment isn't crazy. But what's a little different about this situation is how much of it can be depreciated. But in the sports teams, I think that they're taking the combination of what's the cash flow of the team versus my purchase price, plus what's the value of the things I can depreciate to my overall income. And that two things together is what creates the value that we're seeing accelerate so fast in the last 5, 6, 7 years.
Joe, do you think that there's any political dynamics or worry for having an owner who's now worth almost half of the other owners, with the extreme amount of wealth that's coming from the Waltons? Could that actually throw any wrenches in plans? Or, we're talking about Bezos possibly buying a team in the future. Is that something that the NFL has to worry about?
This is where it really gets interesting when we mix the football and the business part. The answer to your question, through a lot of, I think, very smart moves that the league made before the Deshaun Watson contract was signed, I would say no, there's no real. Once you're wealthy enough to own these teams, there's really nothing that is big enough to really differentiate them. Now, if we're going to start to see 150, 200, $300 million guaranteed contracts that have to be funded, we're going to create a significant advantage for the wealthiest owners. I'd be shocked if the league wasn't working aggressively on anticipating the possibility that what happened with Deshaun Watson isn't going to be the exception going forward. And what do we need to do to maintain the competitive balance that we think's been so important to the growth and success of the league? I'd be shocked if they don't have a group of people working on that as we speak. Could result in consequential changes to the games too. Certainly funding rules, how will they be impacted by guaranteed contracts? Is there an inclination to change the revenue sharing rules between teams, which was done about 10 years ago with tremendous angst and debate and a lot of hard feelings left over from it? Is it going to be a new version of that? I actually think the answer to all those questions is yes, unless somehow Deshaun Watson is a complete aberration, and I don't think that's what's going to end up happening.
Joe, what are steps that you think would help maintain the parity that's been part of the league for so many years?
Well, it's and I don't know what the answer to this is, but it's going back to finding rules where the restraints on what you can spend are within the law, because you have laws that control some of this, even with some of the antitrust waivers that some of the sports leagues have, but won't allow somebody of extraordinary wealth. We've had this before. The ownership group, before the recent change in Seattle, for example, has had just extraordinary wealth, even amongst really wealthy people. They were not able to create what I considered a competitive advantage just based on that. They may have been more willing to say yes to modest expenses that some owners still balk at. But when you really get right down to the basics of what's dividing the winners from the losers, there's a limited ability to impact that. In fact, most of you lived it, because one of the few areas you can do that or could do that was coaching salaries, where there is no cap and you're getting a chance to make create a competitive advantage if you're willing to be financially aggressive and you're a good evaluator of talent. So I don't know what the right answers at this point to do that are, but they've got to get back to the fundamental things that, by the way, there's unanimity in my mind in the league's belief, both in the office and amongst the ownership group, that the one thing that has contributed more than anything else to the league's success is fighting to keep competitive balance real. So all 32 cities and all 32 sets of owners and fans can maintain hope and excitement about the future. And what's happened recently risks changing that in a way that I don't think the league will allow, and I don't even think most owners, including the wealthy ones, really want to see.